few years ago, I had just relocated to my current residence around September, and an event took place in December. We experienced an unusually heavy snowfall, so much so that my workplace was closed for the day. I spent the day relaxing at home, doing nothing unless necessary. My basement was arranged as a gaming and TV lounge, where I spent most of my days off. With the TV on, I was lying on the couch watching something when suddenly, I heard loud banging at the door. The noise was so intense that it echoed throughout the basement, even over my surround sound system. They must have knocked on the door 5 or 6 times. I live in a very peaceful suburban neighborhood, incredibly quiet at night, almost as silent as a mouse. Occasionally, friends would drop by to see my new house, so I initially thought it was one of them, probably just being annoying by banging the door to mess with me since their behavior had been somewhat obnoxious. I continued watching TV, letting whoever it was stay outside, thinking that if it were a friend, they would call or text, and if it were a salesperson or someone trying to sell cookies, they could just leave. After a snowstorm when the roads are icy, I didn't think much about why someone would be out selling cookies. Eventually, I decided to go upstairs to check if there was something left on the porch, or if a friend was waiting for me to open the door. I glanced out the curtain but saw no one, so I opened the door. No one was there, and nothing was on the porch. Down the street, covered in snow and ice, was a black Cadillac with about 4 people inside, slowly moving up the street. One of them was just getting into the back of the car when he heard my front door open and looked back at me, staring until they were too far away to see. It felt odd, but I locked the door and went back to relaxing. Later that day, the news reported that about 4 miles up my street, there had been a home invasion. A woman had been asleep upstairs, and 4 intruders had mistakenly thought the house was empty. They tied her up and robbed the house at gunpoint. She managed to free herself and alert a neighbor, who then called the police and returned with another armed person to check the house. But the thieves had already fled. I'm fairly certain those same 4 individuals were the ones I saw outside my house. If I hadn't decided to go upstairs and open the door when I did, they might have thought my house was vacant and broken in. I can still recall the man staring into my eyes as if he was deciding whether to rob my house or find an easier target. But it seems they chose the latter. Story 2. Whether a friend, rival, or stranger, if you ever find yourself in a tight spot and come across another hunter's cabin, feel free to seek shelter there. Maybe it's an unspoken courtesy because it's common manners, or perhaps it's because there's rarely anyone to talk to during the winter months. In fact, you'd struggle to see another person for weeks, sometimes even months. But that's the rule. If you need it, you use it with no judgment and no questions asked. Just don't steal anything. I'm not a rugged, seasoned mountain man who deals with tree bark and never shaves, but I do enjoy hunting. I often leave my small Alaskan village for weeks at a time to stay at my hunting lodge in the mountains. I'm fairly cautious and aware that the mountains can be deceptive, so when I leave, I ensure I'm prepared. I check long-term weather forecasts, gather necessary supplies, bring backups, and make sure I have enough of everything to survive at least a week longer than planned, just in case. I always believed these precautions would keep me safe, but like a child's security blanket, they were only a thin illusion of safety. There's no real preparation when Mother Nature decides to change her mood, which is why I never expected to be caught in a blizzard. That day started sunny and cold, but as it progressed, clouds gathered until they formed a heavy cover. I was already on my way back to my cabin with a couple of hairs hanging over my shoulders, which I had humorously named dinner and breakfast, since I planned to eat breakfast for dinner and vice versa to amuse myself. It's the little things like that which prevent solitude from turning into loneliness. The snowfall seemed to come out of nowhere, like someone had suddenly released a dammed-up awning. However, it wasn't a single wave of snow, but a relentless, unending assault. The weather reports hadn't predicted a blizzard, yet there I was, walking through one. It grew dark quickly, and I regretted leaving my flashlight at the lodge, as I had intended to return before nightfall, and hadn't thought I needed it. I was sorely mistaken. Snow pricked painfully as it darted into my eyes, forcing me to squint almost shut to keep the sub-zero pellets from blinding me. The wind howled, and snow scales cut through my clothes, reaching my bones. I could barely see 2 feet ahead, and couldn't see the ground beneath me as I sank into an ever-growing blanket of white. I'm not sure when I realized I was lost, but at some point, I knew I should have reached my cabin. All I saw was white with a few gray slivers swaying in the thick breeze. The hairs at the back of my neck stood up, battered against me with every gust of wind and every awkward step. I was running out of energy, ideas, and beginning to panic. I could have spun around in a computer chair 100 times and felt less disoriented. Then I walked right into a cabin. It had become so dark and the snow so heavy that I couldn't see the structure until I stumbled face first into it. I pressed my hands against the wood to avoid losing it in the storm and circled around until I found a door. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience, it was life or death. In the unlikely event someone was inside, I knocked on the door and waited for a response through the howling wind. I could have sworn I heard someone come in. As I swung open the door and stepped inside, a small avalanche of snow tumbled in with me. I didn't bother trying to clear it out as I struggled against the wind to close the door behind me. The relief was immediate. Without the cold air whipping at me, I might have avoided freezing to death. "Thanks," I whispered. I turned toward the interior of the cabin to get my bearings, but saw nothing but darkness, leaving me no real way to engage with the space. I had circled around half-blind, focused on finding a doorknob, unsure of how much of the cabin I had covered. I could have walked halfway through it or circled around 3 times without realizing it. Through the darkness, all I could see was the vague outline of someone sitting in the corner. "Hey, you're a real lifesaver," I said, but he didn't respond. I fumbled around for a lighter, a lantern, a matchbook, anything that might emit light, but all my fingers touched were chains and the barrels of hunting rifles. I stopped poking around, feeling an open bear trap might catch my arm, so it was safer to sit still and wait for dawn. It occurred to me that the stranger might also be seeking refuge, so I began to keep my tone light and innocent. "You the owner of this cabin?" The response was more of a hiss than a word, but in that hiss, I heard a faint yes. I sat on the floor, let my hairs down beside me, and reached into my pack. I had brought a sleeping bag but no flashlight, which puzzled me. I removed my wet clothes and quietly slipped into the sleeping bag to warm up, making small talk as I did. "Hey, thanks again. This blizzard really came out of nowhere," I said. He replied with a slow, labored, wheezy breath, sounding like an elderly man on his deathbed. "Dangerous," I chuckled. "That's an understatement," he sighed. "You got a fireplace?" I asked. "I've got a couple of hares. I'll cook them up. It's the least I can do." His reply was drawn out like a wolf howling without the majestic hum. "No," he said. "Okay. As soon as the blizzard dies down, I'll gather wood and make us a fire. Can you wait until then?" I saw his silhouette shift slightly, accompanied by the rattling of chains. "No," he groaned in a long, bloated manner. "No, yes." The final no morphed strangely into a yes, like someone drastically changing to a much higher note on a flute halfway through a breath. I craned my neck to look at the single window in the cabin. It was pitch black or pitch white, like an afterglow visible against the dark wood backdrop, yet still inherently dark. I focused on it rather than the rest of the cabin because it was the only hint of light I could see. "If you don't mind, I'm going to try to catch some sleep," I said tiredly. He didn't respond, but that didn't surprise me. Mountain folk don't talk much, even when they come down to town for the few supplies they can't make themselves. I shrugged it off and settled in for the night, but I felt something hard against my side. Sighing, I tossed my hair back a bit farther and got comfortable. I was exhausted, so it wasn't too difficult to drift off despite the wind howling outside. I hugged myself in my sleeping bag and fell asleep. I was awakened by a different sound, a weird snapping crunch that made me shoot up in bed, believing the ceiling was about to collapse under the weight of the snow. I braced myself, but as the sound came again, I realized it wasn't above me but rather next to me, near my belongings. The silhouette was gone from the corner, and I could hear his deep, raspy breaths accompanying the crunch. "What the hell are you doing?" I snapped. He retreated back to his corner with a rattling of chains. My adrenaline was pumping, and I wasn't even sure why. Something about the stranger put me in a state of near panic. My instincts told me to leave, but I couldn't afford to. Whatever he was up to, I was safer with him than out there in the blizzard. I grabbed my backpack and propped myself against the wall, seated and staring at the silhouette, expecting him to make a move. I kept myself awake and alert, never looking away, even as the howling wind slowly diminished in strength. Once or twice I felt my head begin to nod and my eyes start to close. But every time I slipped, the faint rattling of chains snapped me back to consciousness. As the blizzard cleared and the sun slowly rose, light began to filter into the cabin in tiny increments, each layer uncovered by the sun, like a printer slowly producing a full picture one line at a time. I realized I wasn't even in a cabin but in a large supply shed, maybe 10 to 11 feet long and 7 to 8 feet wide. There was no fireplace, which made sense for a supply shed. Tools, traps, and rifles lined every wall. The silhouette in the corner stopped being a silhouette and became a distinct person. Skinny, no, actually gaunt and pale, like a ghostly white man. No, it was a corpse. I was devastated. He was dead. Not just dead, but long dead. His body was shriveled and mummified, if that's even the right term. He wasn't wrapped in bandages, but his skin was completely dehydrated and stiff, like an unwrapped mummy. His hair hung in unkempt strands, his teeth poked out of his shrunken lips with a wide gap where the top right canine should have been. There was an old blood stain soaked into the wood beneath him. I followed it with my gaze to its origin, his left foot and the bear trap he had been caught in. There was an empty hook on the wall above him with a chain leading to the trap. It was long enough for him to move around, but not enough to reach the front door or the saw hanging above it. My best guess was the trap had fallen on its own while he was out, and at some point he'd gone on a supply run in the dark and probably got caught in his own trap. He likely died of thirst or something. Look, I'm telling you, he wasn't breathing and he wasn't moving. He was dead as a doornail and had been for quite some time. I reasoned, realizing I must have been delirious from the night before. The fatigue, dehydration, and disorientation caused by the blizzard made me imagine a voice. Those slow, hissing sounds I thought were replies were just the wind outside. I interpreted them incorrectly because loneliness had finally gotten to me. The elements had conspired against me to create a living person out of someone who definitely wasn't alive. It was a logical explanation, and I wished I could say it was. Story 3. For the past 2 years, I've been working at a department store. Although retail wasn't exactly my passion, it was much better than my previous job in the food industry, so I was grateful not to have to handle food all day. I approached customer service much more gracefully than I did in the food business. It was the middle of January, and typically, the store is quite dead towards the end of the day. Usually, the following month after Christmas is never really busy because people probably aren't trying to spend money after the gift-giving season, and the cold Canadian winter doesn't help matters. Additionally, people aren't in the mood to leave the comfort of their homes during a snowstorm, meaning fewer staff are on shift. I was alone in the fitting room. I work at a pretty large store, and given the weather conditions, employees are usually spread out on the floor rather than staying close together like they do during the busy season. None of us wore earpieces. Instead, we used the speaker system for paging. It was a Wednesday night around 8:08 p.m., and the store closed at 9 p.m. I was usually assigned to the cash register, but often frequented the fitting room when help was needed. It was a very quiet night, and I spent the first couple of hours of my shift organizing the beauty section next to the fitting room, or chatting with my lovely coworker who worked in the jewelry section, assisting the few customers who actually wanted to try on clothes. A man came into the fitting room with 2 dress shirts, and I didn't think much of it since he wasn't someone I recognized. He was older, tall, somewhat stocky and muscular, and dressed rather nicely in a clearly expensive suit with a nice shoulder bag. I assumed he must have come to the store after his day at work. I counted the number of clothing items he was bringing in. as that was mandatory for me to monitor the flow of clothes and prevent theft. I handed him a number corresponding to the number of articles he was taking in, and politely asked him to put the clothes back on the hanger in French rather than English, because Quebec requires us to speak French to customers first. He replied with a simple, "No problem." I noticed he had a thick accent, though I couldn't quite place it. Maybe Russian, but I wasn't sure. The man entered the fitting room and I didn't think much of it. I also assisted other customers who came out of their rooms, counting the articles they took and matching them with their numbers before hanging them back on the rack. A few moments passed, and the man finally came out without much thought. I took the clothes back from him since he didn't want any of them, retrieved his number, and thanked him before turning to place the clothes back on their rack. Usually, this is when the customer would just leave the fitting room, but when I turned to go back to the front, he was still there. I asked if there was anything else I could do for him or if he still wanted the shirts I had just put away. The man simply smiled and looked at me, and I felt a strange feeling in the pit of my stomach. He was looking at me as if he wanted to say something, and being the 5'4" girl who hates confrontation, I nervously laughed and started organizing the desks at the entrance of the fitting room, awkwardly arranging all the numbers even though they were already in order. He asked me for my name, to which I looked down at my name tag and repeated it. He told me it was a beautiful name. I laughed nervously, unsure of how to handle the situation, and wanted to be nice since it was part of my job in customer service. Besides, he hadn't done anything wrong. He was just complimenting me. I said thank you and looked away, avoiding eye contact. He then stood there for what felt like 20 minutes, but in reality, it was probably only 3. He remained there as I helped other customers, making me increasingly uncomfortable. I didn't want to be rude, but I also didn't want to stay uncomfortable for the rest of my shift or however long he intended to linger. I asked if he needed any more help, and that's when I began to feel really scared. He proceeded to tell me that he would be waiting for me at 9:30 outside the store's exit doors and wanted to take me out. Confused, I looked at him oddly. How did he know we finished at that time? The store closed at 9 o'clock and we usually spent 30 minutes cleaning up, so I suppose that information wasn't too hard to guess, but it still felt weird. Why did he want to take me out? I nervously laughed again because that seemed to be the only thing I could do when uncomfortable and politely declined, saying I had to go home and study. He laughed, took a step closer, and I instinctively took a step back. He didn't accept my answer and smiled once more. I'll be waiting for you outside the door where all the employees leave from, in the truck alley. I'll be right there. There was a door that employees used to exit the mall because the main doors were usually locked around 9:15, and we always finished later than that. So, we used the door leading to a slight alley where trucks went to drop off shipments for our store. Being someone who hates confrontation and struggles with controlling my emotions, I felt myself start to tear up at his exact comment. No employee is allowed to mention the door we exit from. It's a company rule since we usually finish late, and the parking lot is dark. They don't want anyone to know our exit point as a precaution. I told him once more that I appreciated his offer but wasn't interested, and had to continue my work. I politely asked him to leave when he put a hand on my shoulder, and I felt myself freeze up. I remember thinking and just praying that one of my co-workers would show up, or that the jewelry employee would stop filling cases and turn around. But with my luck, nobody did. He told me I was a beautiful girl and that he couldn't wait to meet me in the alley at the end of my shift. He also mentioned that he had a nice apartment and a cute dog, as if the dog would make me change my mind and we could have a fun time together. At this point, being absolutely desperate, I said I had a boyfriend who was going to pick me up, hoping that would deter him. But he just laughed, said my name, and told me that wasn't something that usually stopped him. I honestly began to feel scared and excused myself to use the phone at my desk, shaking his hand off, which I hadn't realized was gripping me so tightly. I paged the number from my coordinator, who curtly replied that she was busy with a customer, and hung up before I could get a word in. Unsure of what to do, the man was still next to me as he followed me to my desk. I called my manager, who thankfully answered. When he saw I was on the phone, he left the fitting room, but that didn't make me feel any better. I told my manager what had happened, and she freaked out, telling me I needed to report him immediately, reminding me to be very careful around people like that. She advised me to call security, and I did. The security guard informed me he had been watching the man through the cameras around 8:30 p.m., and I was preparing to start my closing tasks, still paranoid about what the man had said. This felt like the beginning of an abduction movie to me. Eventually, I calmed down a little, not seeing the man anymore. When the security guard called me back, he wanted to let me know that the man was still circling the store. I felt more dread than before, but thankfully, he hadn't come back to see me. It felt somewhat better knowing the security guard had seen him, so if anything did happen, there was someone who could identify him. By the time the store closed and it was time to leave, two of my co-workers, Evan and Ethan, two boys who worked in the warehouse, made sure to walk with me all the way to my car, ensuring I wasn't alone. I appreciated that a lot, although I didn't want to admit it. I was scared walking through the alley and even paranoid he might follow me home. I took the extra long route to see if anyone was trailing me, but he wasn't. When I walked through the safety of my house's door and locked it behind me, I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding in. Nowadays, I make sure to leave the store using the buddy system. I never walk alone and always stay hyper-aware of my surroundings. I no longer wear my name tag. Luckily, nothing happened to me, and maybe I was overthinking the entire experience. But I wanted to emphasize that even if your job is in customer service, if someone makes you feel uncomfortable, speak up. You shouldn't have to endure this kind of behavior at work or anywhere else. Story 4. Absolutely, I'm an avid hunter who goes out every season and loves it more often than not. I don't actually kill any game. I just enjoy getting out into the woods. I'm not sure if you're familiar with hunting seasons in Pennsylvania, but during late November, rifle season is in full swing. It was already the second week of the season, and I hadn't bagged any deer yet, so I was eager to get out early in the morning, which I did. I usually wake up around 5 a.m. and drive to my hunting spot. It's on private land that my grandfather owns, and only he and I hunt there. The rest of the land is leased to other hunters, and the only other people on the property are those employed on my grandfather's farm. I had originally planned to call my grandfather when I woke up and ask if he wanted to join me, but the weather that morning was horrendous. The snow was pouring down, and the wind was very strong. I love hunting in the snow, but the severe weather almost made me decide not to go, knowing he wouldn't want to join in such conditions. The roads were really bad, so it took me a bit longer to drive there. Normally the sun would be starting to rise by now, but it was overcast and still snowing. Regardless of the snow, I walked up to my spot, which was directly behind my grandfather's house, over a hill, and back about 100 to 150 yards. Almost immediately upon settling into my spot, I heard things moving all around me. Honestly, I didn't pay much attention to it. It could have been anything, but it was still pitch black, and the thought that it might be a deer crossed my mind. However, there wasn't much I could do. It's not like I could shoot at it. So I ignored it and continued to wait. Not much longer after that, I began hearing something walking just over the ridge to my right. At this point, there was barely enough light to see my feet, so even if it was a deer, there was still nothing I could do. However, I could tell it wasn't a deer. I assumed it was my grandfather walking to his spot, which is just a short walk from mine. But the lights in his house were off, and if he was hunting up here, I'm sure he would have let me know beforehand. Even if it wasn't him, it was another hunter, albeit one hunting illegally. I still wanted to let him know I was there, so I turned on my flashlight and pointed it in his direction, flashing it several times. Again, even if it was a deer, I couldn't shoot it, so I felt it was better to be safe than sorry. Not much happened after that. After I flashed my light, the noise stopped, which was really odd. I didn't hear them turn back, so I figured they either sat down right there after seeing my light, which is considered extremely rude, or walked off. I just assumed it was a deer. About an hour passed, and finally, the first sights of daylight began to shine through. It was still snowing, and the snow was falling in entire snowballs rather than individual flakes, so visibility was pretty limited. But I just grinned. I love snow. Even if I couldn't see any deer, I still found the weather beautiful. It was around this time that I noticed an oddly shaped lump protruding from a group of trees and shrubs atop the hill that separates me from my grandfather's house, the exact spot where I'd heard movement earlier. It looked like a mound of dirt, but it was sticking out from the side of a tree, so it obviously wasn't dirt. Naturally, I raised my rifle to take a closer look and immediately realized I was looking at the side of an older-style camouflage coat. It took a minute, but it finally clicked. It was a person over there. I just thought it was another hunter, so I didn't know what to do about it. I knew he was hunting on our land illegally, and from what I could see, he wasn't wearing anything orange, which is required of all hunters during rifle season. I could tell just by looking that whoever this wasn't my grandfather. I sat there for a minute, debating my next move, but I decided to call my granddad at the risk of interrupting his hunt, if he was indeed the one over there. So, without taking my eyes off the man, I pulled out my phone and dialed his number. To my dismay, he answered. I told him what was happening and he said he would make his way up, but I decided to go on my own to give the man a whistle to let him know I saw him. However, he didn't react at all. After a few minutes, I started to walk towards him. As I approached, I could clearly see him. He was sound asleep, tucked in between a shrub and a couple of trees. He obviously thought out where to lay down, as I would never have been able to see him had his coat not been sticking out. Seeing that he had no orange on him, I gave him another whistle, much louder, and he woke up almost immediately, shuffling over to hide his exposed coat. He had a nasty, scruffy beard and a gray hat. Honestly, he looked like a harmless old homeless man, probably in his 50s. But he had a perfect view of my grandfather's home from his spot, and I had a pretty good idea of what he was planning to do once my granddad left the house. Once this man realized he had been caught and saw my granddad, a mad 6'5" guy carrying a hunting rifle less than 10 yards away. Making his way closer, his face went pale almost instantly. He tried to feed me some information about being lost during a drive with a group of other hunters. For those who don't know, a drive is a coordinated push through a thicket to drive deer to hunters sitting at the end of a designated area. However, the closest public game land is miles away from his spot, so I knew he was lying. He kept going on about how he was lost and had fallen asleep, even making up a fake name on the spot. I just stood there, listening and making sure he didn't make any suspicious movements. I couldn't help but think about what this guy could have done to my grandfather. God knows he had the chance, and that thought angered me enough to tell the man to shut the hell up. That's when I saw my granddad. My granddad is a tough old man, so my first thought was this idiot was going to get himself killed. Luckily, nothing happened after he arrived. We practically had to drag this man down the road where my granddad called the cops, and I called my dad. Technically, this man hadn't done anything wrong yet, so all we could charge him with was trespassing and stalking. That was about a month ago, and since then I haven't heard anything else about him.